The skies above Holy Terra had endured 10,000 years of war, prophecy, and the slow grinding weight of empire. They had swallowed the smoke of a million arrivals, the fire of a million departures, and the constant, reverent hum of defense systems that had never been allowed to sleep. In that unbroken vigilance, the void was a scripture the Imperium believed it understood, harsh, predictable, and ruled by ancient laws. Then the scripture tore. Before we descend into the chaos of this tale, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more legends and dark histories from the Warhammer 40k universe. A wound opened in the heavens without warning, high above the Imperial Palace, shaped not like a warp breach and not like any storm the Astronomicon had ever named. It did not boil with the familiar madness of the Imperium, nor did it shine with the sanctioned purity of Imperial technology. It simply appeared clean and wrong, a silent fissure in reality that made every sensor flare into panic. Auspex arrays spat errors. Cogitators ran in circles, unable to categorize what they saw. The orbital defense grid shifted into readiness by instinct older than memory, but found no target to lock, no trajectory to predict, no doctrine to follow. From the observation tier of a sealed embassy spire near the palace perimeter, the Imperial envoy stood motionless, feeling the floor beneath their boots tremble with the first rising alarms. This was a figure forged for diplomacy in an age that had forgotten the meaning of it, trained to read threat and intention the way others read scripture, and yet the sight above Terra made training feel thin and human. The envoy watched as the breach widened, not violently, but with calm inevitability, as if the universe itself had decided a door belonged there. Across the throne world, billions looked upward in the same breathless second. The hive districts fell into a hush threaded with fear. Cathedrals rang warning tones. Barracks emptied into perfect formation. Even the custodes, silent sons of gold, moved with a speed that suggested something older than danger, something like memory stirring in their bones. All systems cried incursion, yet none could name the intruder. A presence was coming through, ancient and impossible, and Terra could only feel it the way a body feels a blade before it sees the hand that holds it. The envoy's mind reached for precedent and found none. Not chaos, not Xenos, not a rogue machine voice in the data stream. This was a silence that carried weight, a kind of arrival that did not ask permission from reality. The words came steady and low inside them, not spoken aloud, but settling like iron. Whatever steps through that wound will not be like anything this world has learned to survive. The breach brightened, not with flame, but with a pale, starborn sheen, and something moved within it, descending as if gravity itself had been rewired to welcome the unknown. The envoy felt the air change, the way it does before a storm breaks, and understood with calm certainty that the age of routine crisis had ended in this moment, and something cleaner, stranger, and far more dangerous was about to begin. Something emerged from the heart of the wound with the unhurried certainty of a figure that had never learned to fear the void. No roar of engines announced the descent, no warp lightning clawed around the shape, no ritual shielding flared to mark a sanctioned arrival. The breach simply opened wider, then released its traveler, as if letting fall a single drop of another universe into the sky of Terra. At first, the envoy saw only a silhouette against that pale, starborn light, a human outline, and yet not human in the way Terra had come to define the word. The figure moved through the air without resistance, descending in a straight line, calm as a law of physics. The cape-like drape behind her did not whip like a banner in storm winds. It settled with a quiet grace, as though the atmosphere itself deferred. Armor caught the light in clean, unfamiliar angles, neither imperial plate nor Xeno's shell, but something that carried the elegance of a civilization that had never needed to worship its machines. The landing was gentle, a footfall on ancient stone that should have sparked volleys of automated fire, yet no weapons spoke. The defense grid did not lock, the palace batteries did not groan awake, even the scanning arrays hesitated, their machine spirits choking on readings that made no sense in imperial categories. The envoy felt that delay as a kind of collective instinct, Terra pausing the way a herd pauses before a predator it has never named. She straightened in the open light of the platform, face uncovered, posture unguarded, and every detail sharpened the envoy's unease. Thena did not arrive like a conqueror. There was no theatrical flair, no raised hand, no proclamation designed to dominate the moment. The stillness around her was not weakness. It was the stillness of something that knew it could endure whatever came next. A faint wind moved over the platform, stirring dust and prayer ashes alike. Thena let it pass over her armor without reaction. Eyes lifted to the skyline, to the distant spires of the Imperial Palace, to the endless city layered with scars of devotion and war. There was no reverence in that gaze, no horror either. Instead, the envoy saw something colder and more precise, the look of a warrior who had crossed millennia of violence and learned to measure worlds by what they had become. The envoy had spent a lifetime reading faces across war tables and council halls, searching for the fracture where intention hides. Thena offered no fracture. The expression remained composed, thoughtful, and yet the air around her felt heavier with each quiet breath. Not because of sorcery, not because of technology, but because the body beneath that armor carried power in the simplest form Terra understood, strength that did not need to announce itself to be true. For a long moment she said nothing. Silence stretched across the platform like a held cord. The custodes formed their shimmering line at the far edge. The envoy felt their tension even from this distance, a readiness sharpened by something close to disbelief. Still, no words came from the newcomer. She only looked, as if weighing the empire before her, as if taking the measure of a civilization that had forgotten how to measure itself. The envoy realized, with a slow tightening in the chest, that this was not an entrance meant to impress. It was an arrival meant to assess, the kind that comes before a verdict, and before any verdict can be spoken, a world must first be seen for what it truly is. The envoy held that thought quietly, feeling it settle like the first stone of an avalanche, and understood that Terra had been judged the instant Thena's eyes rose to its broken horizon. The first response of the throne world was not fear, but habit. Ancient routines older than most stars awakened in perfect sequence, as if the planet itself had muscles that moved before thought. In the void above Terra, the orbital defense grid rolled into alert formation. Layers of weapons that had slept in patient readiness swung outward on invisible rails. Targeting arrays swept the breach, then swept again, widening their search in spirals that had once found reavers in the dark and sealed the skies against traitor armadas. Yet nothing resolved into a lock. The envoy watched the tactical hololiths pulse and jitter on the embassy wall. Every line of data refused to stabilize. The breach was there, Thena was there, the readings confirmed both, but the machines could not reconcile presence with category. The systems were built to recognize the warp signature violence, the familiar stain of Xeno's craft, the encrypted identity of Imperial hulls. This was none of those. It was a clean insertion into reality, like a blade sliding between ribs without tearing the skin first. In the command vox around the palace perimeter, alarm codes stacked over one another as officers tried to force meaning onto the impossible. The defense cogitators did not fail outright. They simply paused, caught in logic loops that had no branch for what they were witnessing. No hostile vector could be calculated because there was no hostile vector to measure. No energy profile matched any threat doctrine. The grid hung in readiness without direction, not disabled, not seized. It stood waiting, as if expecting the universe to explain itself. On the platforms and battlements below, Imperial regiments moved into disciplined formations, their banners snapping in the wind. They raised rifles, leveled heavy bolters, waited for the order that would make the situation normal again. The order did not come. The envoy felt the delay in the tightness of the air, in the way no commander wanted to be the first to name this arrival a war, and no commander dared name it peace. It was not that Thena controlled their defenses. The envoy knew what true subversion looked like, had studied histories of machine plagues and Hirdeck infiltrations. Those had signatures, glitches, pulses of alien command. Nothing like that rippled through Terra systems now. The rumor of domination was absent. Instead, there was a subtler weight, the kind that fell on a room when someone entered who does not need to raise a hand to command attention. Across the hololith, the icon marking Thena's position remained steady at the palace threshold. No shield flare surrounded her. No emission spike betrayed a device interfacing with Imperial systems. She simply stood there, utterly visible, utterly unhurried, and Terra hesitated as if confronted by a law it had forgotten. The envoy realized that the paralysis was not technological. It was psychological, a reflex in the bones of an empire that had spent millennia reacting to threats by annihilating them before they could be understood. Now a presence had arrived that did not behave like threat, did not behave like supplicant, and so the Imperium's oldest instinct, to destroy, stumbled for the first time in living memory. From the hive depths to the high spires, a stillness spread. It was the stillness of a civilization sensing that its next motion would define it, and finding itself uncertain what definition it could still live with. The envoy felt that uncertainty settle over the palace complex like dust after a shockwave, and understood that this pause was a doorway, one Terra might never get again. With the defenses hanging silent above and the ground forces waiting below, the envoy turned toward the landing platform, knowing the moment for approach had arrived, and that whatever was said next would tip the stillness into history. In an age where diplomacy had become a ceremonial word etched into dead parchment, the envoy was a rare thing, a remnant of humanity's earlier posture toward the galaxy. Long before the Imperium had sealed itself inside dogma and siege doctrine, before every unknown was treated as an enemy to be purged, there had been explorers who crossed the stars with open hands as well as open guns. The envoy carried that lineage quietly, not as rebellion, but as purpose. The embassy where they served had once been a crossroads for negotiation between Imperial arms, Mechanicus logic, and the handful of allied voidfaring houses that still remembered old agreements. Over decades, the role had thinned into ritual, messages carried between factions that no longer wanted understanding, only compliance. Still, the envoy remained trained in the disciplines of calm assessment, in careful speech, in the belief that even in grim darkness, a mind could be reached before a trigger was pulled. Now that training was thrumming in their blood like a second heart. The order to approach Thena came from the highest ring of authority that could speak quickly enough, a triad of voices stitched together by urgency rather than trust. The Senatorum demanded stability, the Custodes demanded containment, the Mechanicus demanded data. Between those demands, someone remembered the embassy's purpose and named the envoy the necessary bridge. The envoy accepted without surprise. The acceptance did not feel heroic. It felt inevitable, the way a ship's navigator steps to the helm when the storm hits. To refuse would be to leave the first words of this encounter to warriors who knew only the grammar of threats. They dressed not in ornate robes meant to impress, but in the clean, functional regalia of office, a badge of Terra's authority without the heavy symbolism of priesthood. A slender vox link rested at the throat. A data slate with access to all relevant threat protocols lay against the forearm. These were tools for dialogue, not ceremony. The envoy moved through embassy corridors alive with alarm, through adepts chanting readiness prayers, through guard detachments who watched their passage with a mixture of respect and dread. At each doorway, the palace walls felt closer. The envoy could sense the weight of the Imperium pressing inward, as if the entire empire lined toward this platform to hear what would be said. Hidden among that weight was something quieter, a personal memory of the human future the envoy had once studied, a future where diplomacy was not weakness, and exploration was a virtue rather than a risk. That memory did not make the envoy naive. It sharpened their resolve. In a civilization that endured by reflex and fear, the envoy's job was to introduce pause, to hold open the possibility that understanding might be safer than panic. As they stepped into the open air and the immense landing platform spread out ahead, Thena stood already framed by ancient stone and distant gold. The custodes watched from the far edge, a wall of sovereign violence that had not yet decided whether to fall. The defense grid above still hovered in uncertain alert. Every eye turned toward the envoy as if watching a single thread stretched across a chasm. The envoy felt no rush now, only a solemn clarity. This was what their years of quiet, unfashionable training had been for, standing between old fear and a new unknown, trying to keep the universe from collapsing into war simply because it was easier than thought. With that certainty steady and low, they walked forward to become the first human voice this arrival would meet, and the first witness to what Thena truly was. The envoy crossed half the platform before Thena acknowledged the approach. When she finally turned, it was without tension, without the slight shift of weight that betrayed readiness for combat. Attention moved to the envoy the way a star draws orbit, naturally, precisely, without effort. The calm in that gaze did not dismiss danger. It simply assumed it could be managed. Up close, the armor's elegance was even stranger. Its lines were not built around brutality, but around motion, a warrior's frame crafted by a people who revered skill as much as force. The surface held no imperial sigils, no Xenos markings, no devotional scratches. It was clean, not because it was untrodden, but because it did not need relics to justify itself. The envoy noticed the way Terra's air seemed to settle around her, as if the planet, too, had become careful. For a breath, neither spoke. The silence between them did not feel hostile. It felt like a threshold, as if language itself was waiting to see which direction it should flow. Then Thena spoke, and the voice was simpler than the envoy expected. No swelling oath, no proclamation of superiority, not even a demand to be recognized. She introduced herself plainly, Thena, eternal of another sky, and the words came steady and low, carrying the weight of 1,000 lived ages without leaning on them for drama. What followed was not a claim of conquest. She did not say she had come to rule Terra, nor to tear down its thrones. Instead, she asked, with a directness that cut through ritual like clean steel, why humanity had chosen this way of living. Why an empire born of the stars had folded into endless war, endless fear, endless devotion to suffering disguised as virtue. The envoy felt the question land like a controlled detonation. It was not heresy shouted from a pulpit. It was diagnosis offered at bedside. Thena's gaze drifted to the imperial palace, to the horizon where towers rose like spears in a frozen march. She spoke of what she had sensed on arrival, the hard rhythm of a civilization pinned to survival by brute repetition. She said she had not come to take Terra's name for herself, but to understand how a species capable of reaching beyond worlds had ended in a prison of its own traditions. This was not scorn. It was something closer to grief, carried with a warrior's restraint. The envoy answered carefully, not with propaganda, but with truth shaped for survival. They spoke of the wars that never ended, of the warp's predations, of the betrayal that had burned brighter than faith could mend. They spoke of the Emperor's dream and what millennia of siege had done to it. Each sentence was measured, not to persuade Thena of Terra's righteousness, but to show the shape of Terra's wounds. As the envoy spoke, they realized Thena was listening in a way few imperial authorities ever did. No impatience flickered across her face. No hidden calculation crawled behind her eyes. She listened as if this mattered, as if the Imperium was not a monolith to be crushed or exploited, but a living civilization worth understanding before any judgment was passed. When the envoy finished, Thena nodded slightly. The movement was small, but it carried a kind of acceptance, not agreement, but recognition of suffering as real. She said that war might be unavoidable in a universe like this, yet the way Terra had made war into identity was a choice, not a fate. Her presence, she implied, was not meant to steal choice away, but to force the choice to be seen again. Behind them, the Custodes' line remained rigid, the air thick with the anticipation of violence. The envoy felt how easily this conversation could be shattered by one misread gesture. Still, the tone Thena set was not a spark. It was a candle held against a cavern wall, trying to show the outline of what had been lost. The envoy sensed the platform tilting, not physically, but morally, shifting from immediate threat toward dangerous possibility. That possibility was fragile, and the next response from the Imperium would decide whether it became dialogue or disaster. With the words settling between them like a bridge half built, Thena let her gaze return to the palace gates, as if expecting the Empire to answer for itself, and the envoy felt the standoff drawing closer, step by solemn step. The Eternity Gate was not just a threshold of stone and adamant. It was an idea-given architecture, the physical line between the Imperium's mortal machinery and the Emperor's silent presence. Around it, every wall, every watchtower, every gilded seal existed to remind the galaxy that some places were beyond approach, some truths beyond negotiation. The Custodes embodied that reminder in living form. They advanced now in flawless formation, gold like captured sunlight, their guardian spears held in disciplined readiness rather than raised in fury. The envoy stepped back as protocol required, not to abandon the role of mediator, but to acknowledge the older law walking forward. The Captain General took position at the front, posture rigid as a monument. Silence filled the space where a lesser army would have shouted warnings. The Custodes did not need volume to command the world's attention. Their presence alone tightened the air, a field of absolute loyalty that had never bent, even when Primarchs walked the palace halls. When the Captain General spoke, the voice carried with it the weight of 10 millennia of unbroken vigil. The demand was simple: leave this ground or submit to its authority. He did not couch it in threats, because the threat was implied by every spear and every helm facing her. He did not offer compromise, because compromise at the gate was how ruin had entered once before. Thena did not flinch. Her gaze met the Captain General's with a steady calm that unsettled even the envoy. This was not defiance for spectacle. It was the composure of someone who had crossed empires and survived gods, and who would not betray herself by kneeling to a system she had not yet judged. She refused both demands. The refusal was not loud. It was clean. She said she would not leave without understanding, and she would not kneel to an authority that had not yet shown it could serve humanity rather than imprison it. The words were spoken with control, not contempt, and still they struck the Custodes' line like a blade across ceremony. A ripple moved through the warriors, not fear, never fear, but the brief recalibration that follows an unexpected variable. The envoy felt that ripple as a tightening in their throat. This was the moment where history could snap toward violence, where a single breath could become a war drum. The Captain General stepped closer, spear angling forward by a fraction. The fragment of movement carried more meaning than any shouted order. It said that the Emperor's will was not negotiable, that the gate was not a place where outsiders stood and debated civitas or destiny. Thena held her ground. She did not widen her stance, did not raise her hands, did not ready a weapon the way imperial threats always did. She remained still enough that the silence around her felt chosen. The envoy watched the distance between gold and emerald armor shrink to a space measured in heartbeats. Only then did it become clear how strange Thena's refusal truly was. A lesser invader would have postured, invoked power, threatened annihilation. She did none of that. Her denial was not based on the belief she could win a battle, but on the belief that kneeling was morally impossible. That belief was dangerous to the Imperium, even more than strength. Strength could be met with strength. Belief could fracture an empire from within. The Captain General repeated the demand once more, each word like a seal pressed into iron. Thena answered once more with calm certainty. She would not pass the gate. She would not kneel before it. She would stand where she stood until Terra decided whether it wanted to speak with her as a civilization or strike her as a reflex. The standoff solidified into something heavier than confrontation. It became a test of what Terra truly was. The envoy felt their pulse slow, not from peace, but from the solemn awareness that the next move would be physical. The line had been drawn, and now it waited to be crossed. The first strike came not from rage but from doctrine. A custodian stepped forward with the Captain General's tacit permission, the kind of permission that did not need a spoken word. The warrior's movements were precise, economical, a ritual honed through centuries of slaughter in defense of a single throne. The guardian's spear swept toward Thena's centerline, fast enough to end a lesser life before thought could follow. Thena moved as though she had been waiting for this inevitability, not with panic, not with flourish, but with the clean speed of an eternal whose body knew war as a native language. She met the spear's thrust head-on. One hand caught the haft with a sound like metal biting stone. The impact shuddered through the platform, not from any energy burst, not from machinery awakening, but from raw force colliding with raw force. The envoy's auger implants registered the moment in delayed astonishment. No psychic flare accompanied her motion. No technology field rose to soften the blow. There was only strength, unadorned and undeniable, the kind the Imperium respected even when it feared it. The custodian tried to wrench free. The spear did not budge. Thena's grip held like an anchored star. She twisted once, a subtle turn of wrist that redirected the weapon's momentum into emptiness, then stepped inside the spear's reach in a single smooth arc. Armor brushed armor. A knee struck the custodian's side with controlled violence, enough to break stance without breaking bone. The warrior staggered back, and before the next motion could become lethal, Thena turned the spear in his hands, not snapping it, not corrupting it, simply stripping it away as easily as a parent takes a blade from a child. She did not follow with a killing blow. She did not even advance. She offered the weapon back by laying it flat on the stone between them, gesture slow and deliberate, saying without words that the fight was finished because she had decided it was finished. The custodian rose again, breath steady, helmet facing her with the unyielding hostility of loyalty. Yet there was also a new layer beneath that hostility, the recognition that this opponent was not a sorcerer twisting fate, not a technarch rewriting the grid. This was a warrior matching them on the only ground that mattered here, discipline and strength. The envoy saw how the custods' line tightened, spears angling in unison. They had witnessed their brother defeated, and yet no shout rose from their ranks. Their doctrine did not allow surprise to become disorder. Still, the platform was no longer the same. The Imperium had just learned something essential. Thena could have killed. She had chosen not to. That choice carried more threat than bloodshed would have. It implied control, confidence, a moral posture that refused to acknowledge the custods as her superiors in battle or in purpose. She had not come to kneel. She had not come to slaughter. She had come to stand, and by standing she had shown Terra that its most sacred guardians were not the final measure of power in the universe. The Captain General studied her in silence. The envoy felt that study like a blade drawn slowly from its sheath. A single duel had shifted the standoff's center of gravity. If Thena could meet a custodian and leave him alive by choice, then her presence was not a passing anomaly. It was a new variable Terra could not erase by tradition alone. The envoy's mind returned to Thena's earlier question about humanity's path, and now the question seemed heavier, edged by the proof of her restraint. Terra had answered her with steel, and steel had returned to Terra in her hands without blood. The Empire was being invited to respond again, perhaps in a language it had long forgotten. As the defeated custodian stepped back into line and the spear wall reformed, the platform settled into a deeper silence, one shaped not by fear, but by the solemn weight of possibilities opening. and the envoy felt the next days of standoff gathering around them like approaching weather. The duel ended without blood, but it did not end the tension. It set it into a slower, heavier orbit. Over the next hours, the landing platform near the Eternity Gate became a fixed point in Terra's consciousness, a place where time seemed to compress and expand at once. Thena remained where she had stood, neither advancing nor retreating, a calm figure framed by ancient stone and the unblinking gold of the custodes. The envoy returned to the embassy, with the duel's echo still in their chest, feeling the city's breath change around them. Terra entered a week of waiting, not the patient waiting of a world at peace, but the strained stillness of a pressure chamber sealed too long. The defense grid stayed in alert patterns above the atmosphere, its machine spirit cycling through readiness without a command to resolve into action. Regiments rotated in formation along the palace perimeter, weapons ready yet idle. The ecclesiarchy flooded Vox channels with warnings of heresy. The Mechanicus issued quiet data petitions. The Senatorum argued in closed halls, thick with fearful incense. No faction moved to strike, not because the Imperium had become merciful, but because uncertainty had become lethal. To attack Thena risked failure, and failure on the steps of the Imperial Palace would fracture authority in a way no enemy fleet ever could. To permit her presence risked the slow corrosion of doctrine, a far subtler collapse. Terra stalled between those risks, and the stall itself became a kind of revelation. Across the hive sprawl, millions watched through sanctioned feeds and illicit relays. The underhives whispered her name as if it had always belonged to this sky. The noble houses watched with cautious fascination. Even in barracks and manufactoria, workers spoke of the silent warrior who had faced the emperor's guardians and chosen restraint. In a city that lived by fear, restraint was almost incomprehensible, and so it became mythical. The envoy moved through the growing corridors of rumor, hearing how quickly a symbol can be born. Some called her a savior sent to test Terra's resolve. Others called her an omen of a new age, neither warp-tainted nor Xenos corrupt. Some, more dangerous, called her proof that the Imperium's dogma was no longer the final law of reality. She had not spoken another word since the first encounter, yet her silence was interpreted in 1,000 ways, each interpretation shaping a faction before any faction declared itself aloud. Inside the embassy war room, the envoy worked among looping tactical projections and shifting political maps. Messages arrived from distant sector lords asking for clarification. Others came from local commanders demanding authorization to fire. The envoy answered each with the same measured truth. No strike has been ordered. No doctrine accounts for this presence. Patience is the only tool that does not risk catastrophe. The words sounded calm in Vox form. In the envoy's mind, they felt like thin wire stretched over a rising chasm. Each day of the standoff layered more meaning onto Thena's unmoving stance. She became a mirror in which Terra saw itself. A civilization of endless mobilization was being held still by the simple act of not reacting. That stillness forced old questions to surface, questions long buried beneath alarms and sermons. The envoy recognized the danger in that, and also the possibility. In another age, a different humanity might have greeted such a visitor with councils and open halls. In this age, the best anyone could do was not pull the first trigger. By the 7th day, the standoff was no longer only about an intruder on a platform. It was about whether Terra could survive the shock of encountering a power it could not categorize. The envoy felt the world's breath tighten toward breaking point, and sensed that the waiting could not last much longer. Something would come to force the next movement, as inevitability always did, and the week of legend would hand its weight to whatever arrived next. On the 8th day, Terra received an answer it recognized, not from Thena, not from any internal council, but from the old wound that had never stopped bleeding. The Immaterium tore open above the throne world's outer sanctums, far from the palace spires yet close enough to stain the sky with wrongness. The breach was violent and familiar, a rip of warplight that screamed through every sensor in a language Terra had learned to fear since its first steps into the void. The envoy saw the alarms flare across hololiths like a second sunrise, except this dawn was the color of decay. Reports poured in from defense stations, voxes thick with static and panic. A demon incursion, the kind that had carved scars into Terra's history again and again. The Empire did not hesitate in confusion this time. Doctrine snapped into place with reflexive certainty. Regiments mobilized. The Adeptus Arbites sealed transit arteries. Black ships in orbit rotated into suppressive patterns. The Sisters of Silence moved toward the breach with their cold null wake. The Custodes did not leave the Eternity Gate, but their readiness sharpened, knowing every demon that breached Terra was a threat not only to citizens, but to the sanctity of the throne itself. And yet, as the envoy watched the deployment cascade, old inefficiencies emerged like ghosts. Orders threaded through a labyrinth of authority. Ritual checks delayed firing solutions. Mechanicus adepts debated the correct canticles to awaken dormant batteries. The ecclesiarchy demanded purity rites before the redistribution of munitions. The machinery of war was immense, but it moved like a giant bound in its own chains, each tradition another weight around its ankles. The envoy had seen this pattern in every crisis, the empire surviving by sacrifice rather than speed, by devotion rather than clarity. It had worked often enough to become holy. Yet watching a familiar nightmare unfold now, beneath the shadow of Thena's calm presence, the pattern looked less like strength and more like habit stretched to breaking. From the breach spilled shapes that did not belong to real space, forms twisting between nightmare and symbol, shrieking in frequencies that made mortals claw at their ears. They surged toward population clusters, toward defense nodes, toward any place where fear could be harvested into wider rifts. The first barrage from Imperial batteries arrived late, beautifully destructive and poorly timed. It burned a slice of the host, but more poured through behind it. The envoy felt the old dread rise, not as surprise but as bitter familiarity. Terra had prepared for this for 10,000 years, and still every incursion found some weakness in the ritual armor of response. The city could endure another demon war, perhaps, but at the cost of tens of millions of lives, and another step deeper into the belief that only suffering kept humanity alive. Through the embassy's upper viewports, the envoy glimpsed the distant sky over the sanctum zone turning to ash-red storm. They knew what was supposed to happen next. The Empire would grind forward, slow and holy, until the breach closed under mountains of corpses. It was the usual nightmare, the kind Terra survived by calling survival a virtue. Then the envoy sensed movement at the landing platform, not a deployment order, not a Vox command, just the quiet shift of Thena turning toward the distant storm. The envoy felt the story bending, as if two realities were about to intersect, and the familiar nightmare was about to meet an unfamiliar answer. Thena did not ask for permission, and did not wait for the Empire to finish its ceremony of readiness. The moment the demon breach declared itself, she began to walk. The envoy watched from the embassy's threshold as she crossed the platform with the same unhurried stride that had held Terra in stasis for a week. There was no rush in her movement, yet every step carried intent. The Custodes line tracked her, spears shifting in subtle arcs. No order rose to stop her. The Captain General's rigid posture held, as if weighing whether this was a trespass or an opportunity. The envoy felt the tension of that calculation. Terra's guardians could not allow an unknown power to roam freely in sacred zones, yet the incursion unfolding beyond the walls was a threat even they could not deny. Thena offered no plea to pass. She simply advanced toward the direction of battle, and the Custodes, for the first time in a week, did not block the path. As she moved beyond the palace perimeter, the city unfolded into a corridor of alarm. Sirens wailed along transit spines. Civilian crowds pressed into shelters. Columns of Imperial Guard thundered toward the breach with armor that still smelled of sanctified oil. Thena walked past them like a quiet current moving in the opposite direction of panic. Her presence did not scatter the soldiers, it steadied them. A figure who did not flinch before the warp was a rare anchor in the storm of fear. The envoy followed at distance, duty pulling them forward even as caution whispered to remain behind walls. Close enough to witness, far enough to avoid interfering, that was the role now. Through streets lit by flickering emergency lumen, the envoy saw Thena's posture remain balanced, shoulders loose, head lifted, eyes fixed on the sky where warplight churned. At the edge of the Sanctum district, the air was already thick with psychic rot. Reality felt bruised. Buildings groaned under the pressure of abnormal physics. The demon host had spilled into plazas and manufactoria yards, tearing into defenses that arrived too late. Thena stepped into that chaos as if crossing into familiar terrain. No rune glowed on her armor. No field shimmered into being. No machine unfolded at her command. She carried no sorcery to throw back at the warp. She carried only herself. The first demon lunged, a thing of serrated limbs and impossible angles. Thena met it with a single strike. The blow did not flare with energy, did not invoke any unseen power. It was pure force delivered with perfect geometry. The creature burst apart under the impact, unmade by strength that dwarfed its warp-born fury. Another followed, then another, as the host began to recognize her as a threat. She moved through them with speed that made the envoy's eyes struggle to track, not teleporting, not bending space, simply crossing distance faster than any human body could survive. Each motion was disciplined, each kill was efficient. She did not waste movement on cruelty. She did not linger over fallen enemies. She went where the tier was widest, where the breach fed the host, where civilians were trapped behind broken shelter doors. When a cluster of demons surged toward a floundering guard squad, she interposed herself without hesitation, taking the brunt of their assault and breaking their bodies with clean, decisive blows. The envoy felt the rhythm of the battle shift. Imperial forces fought with volume and firepower, but also with fear and ritual delay. Thena fought like a blade in a surgeon's hand, cutting without rage, without wasted breath. She was not erasing the warp itself, but she was breaking the invasion's spine the way a warrior breaks a formation, by removing the confidence that holds it together. As the host began to falter, the envoy understood something quietly chilling. The Imperium had thrown armies at every breach since history began. Thena had walked in alone, and the breach was already shrinking under the weight of her refusal to yield. The storm over the Sanctum zone began to dim. The host recoiled. The envoy felt the war's direction turn in the space of minutes, and sensed that the world was seeing more than victory. It was seeing a new way of surviving. The battle was not finished, but the meaning of it had already begun to spread. When the demons broke, they broke like a tide pulled backward by a moon it did not understand. The warp breach did not vanish at once. It retreated in jagged pieces, shrinking as if starved of fear and momentum. The remaining host scattered into alleys and ruined plazas, hunted down by guardsmen who suddenly found their courage rising faster than their prayers. The sky above the Sanctum zone cleared in slow strokes, leaving scars of smoke and ash where reality had been bruised. The envoy walked the edge of the aftermath, watching how quickly a population begins to rewrite its story when it sees something it never expected. Servitors dragged the wounded from rubble. Medici teams moved between shelter clusters. Vox channels shifted from panic to stunned relief. And through all of it, Thena moved like a quiet pivot around which the district began to stabilize. She did not stand atop wreckage to claim victory. She did not accept cheers because there were none yet, only the shaken silence of people who had watched a legend carve itself into their streets. She kept moving, searching for survivors, lifting collapsed beams with the same hands that had shattered demons. The envoy saw her pull a civilian transport free from a crater, lay it gently on level ground, and step aside so Medici could reach the trapped. No flourish marked the act, just an unspoken priority, life first. To the Imperium, war was often the quickest path to order. It burned whole blocks to cleanse taint. It sacrificed thousands to hold a line. It called those sacrifices holy, and they were in a world this cruel. Yet what Thena had done was not holy in that way. It was precise, restrained, protective. She had fought like a warrior of old myth, but she had chosen targets as if every non-combatant mattered. The envoy felt the contrast sharpen in their mind. The Imperium survived by accepting collateral death as unavoidable. Thena behaved as if collateral death was a failure that must be minimized. That difference was subtle to a strategist, yet seismic to a civilization built on fatalism. Civilians emerged from shelters slowly, eyes wide, bodies trembling from the psychic echo of warp proximity. They looked at her as they might look at a saint, then hesitated, uncertain how to name a protector who did not speak in sermons. Children stared from behind adults' legs. Wounded guardsmen offered awkward salutes, unsure whether protocol applied to a being outside all codexes. Thena inclined her head to them with simple respect, not as a ruler acknowledging subjects, but as a soldier acknowledging soldiers. Word spread through the Sanctum district in soft waves. It leapt from Vox Tower to Vox Tower, down into hive channels and up into noble comms. A warrior had entered the nightmare without armies and had led with mercy rather than spectacle. That story found fertile ground in a population exhausted by centuries of surviving only through brutality. It did not overturn faith overnight. It loosened something deeper, the belief that survival must always be bought with maximum suffering. The envoy watched Imperial officers in the district struggle to decide how to frame what they had witnessed. Some wanted to call it a sanctioned miracle to preserve morale. Others wanted to bury it beneath battle reports to prevent her influence. Yet the people had already seen. Once something is seen, it cannot be unseen, and Terra's citizens had seen protection without terror. Thena paused at the edge of a shattered plaza, looking up at the retreating scar in the sky. The posture was thoughtful, not triumphant. The envoy felt that thought radiate outward, as if she were listening to the city's pulse. The city, in turn, seemed to listen back. In the quiet after the last shriek faded, the envoy sensed a shift settling over Terra, not a revolution, not even a declared movement, but a small crack in the wall of inevitability. The people had witnessed another way a powerful being could carry war, and the crack would spread into the next question, and the next, until the Empire had to answer them. A single battle can be explained away as circumstance. A week of standoff can be dismissed as anomaly. A victory over demons on Terra itself, achieved without sorcery, without machines, and with an unmistakable restraint toward civilian life, could not be reduced so easily. As the Sanctum Zone recovered, the ripples of Thena's intervention reached the palace fast, infiltrating every faction like a silent broadcast. The Mechanicus moved first, as it always did when confronted by the unknown. Requests arrived at the embassy in sealed bursts, layered with respectful binaric framing. They sought permission to study her physiology, to analyze the origin of her armor, to map the energy patterns her body must generate to carry such strength. The adepts did not call her divine, but the hunger in their logic was close to worship. An eternal alive on Terra was a living relic of a technological lineage the Mechanicus had dreamed of recovering for millennia. Imperial administrators reacted with another instinct, more utilitarian and more afraid. They sent quiet inquiries to military channels, surveying how her presence might be integrated into defense doctrine. Could she be deployed to breach zones on other worlds? Could her strength anchor faltering systems? Could her symbol calm riots and rally regiments? In their voices, the envoy heard ambition wrapped in necessity, the desire to make the unknown serve the familiar machine of rule. The ecclesiarchy responded with fire because that was its cleanest language. Sermons flooded public vox, naming her an unsanctioned power, a test of faith, a lure meant to pull humanity from the emperor's light. They did not deny the victory, but reframed it as danger, salvation offered by a hand that did not kneel. Priests called for vigilance, some called for purge. The Sanctum district had seen mercy in motion. The ecclesiarchy feared mercy that did not arrive through its own ritual gates. The Inquisition fractured along old fault lines. Puritans demanded her immediate destruction, arguing that any power outside imperial classification was by definition corrosive. Others urged observation, noting that a being who fought the warp without yielding to it might be a tool against greater threats. The debates were not held openly, but the envoy felt them in the shifting tone of official messages, in the way each inquiry arrived laced with suspicion or cautious hope. Even the custodes, outwardly unmoved, had been altered in the smallest visible ways. Their line at the eternity gate did not relax, but the posture of absolute certainty had gained a thin layer of calculation. Thena's restraint in the duel and her intervention in the sanctum zone had introduced a question they were not built to answer. What if the intruder is not a predator, but something else? The envoy watched these splits form, feeling years of diplomatic training activate like a forgotten muscle. Each faction was reacting to Thena not only as a threat or an asset, but as a mirror reflecting its own weakness. The Mechanicus saw stagnation and lusted for renewal. Administrators saw inertia and wanted a lever strong enough to move empire-scale decay. Priests saw loss of doctrinal control. Inquisitors saw a challenge to the premise that only fear keeps humanity alive. What the envoy saw deeper than all of it was rot exposed by contrast. Thena had not changed Terra by force. She had changed it by being something Terra was not. She stood calm where Terra panicked. She acted fast where Terra delayed. She protected civilians where Terra accepted collateral death. That contrast was now splitting loyalties along lines that had existed for centuries, but had never been forced into the open so clearly. Inside the embassy, the envoy compiled summaries for the Senatorum while weighing every word, aware that narrative would become weapon here. To call her ally would inflame the custodes and ecclesiarchy. To call her enemy would inflame the Mechanicus and the people who had witnessed her restraint. Neutrality was a tightrope over a widening abyss. As night lights rose over the hive sprawl, the envoy understood that Thena's true impact was no longer limited to battlefields or platforms. She had become a gravitational point in Terra's politics, pulling old factions into new shapes, and the shape the Empire chose to take next would determine whether this moment became an awakening or the opening chapter of another civil wound. The envoy felt the coming days gather like distant thunder, and knew the story was shifting toward its next escalation. The summons came at dusk, not in the form of command, but in a quiet request transmitted through the embassy's secure channel. Thena wished to speak again, away from the palace perimeter and the glare of entire factions. The envoy understood the significance immediately. After a week of standoff and a battle that had shifted the city's pulse, Thena was choosing a private conversation as her next move. That choice felt deliberate, almost merciful, and it carried the weight of a door opening where Terra had kept doors sealed for millennia. They met within a chamber the embassy reserved for rare negotiating rights, a place designed to feel neutral even inside the shadow of the imperial palace. Lumen strips threw soft light across sealed walls. Vox dampeners held the air steady against eavesdropping. The envoy stood with hands unarmed and posture formal, yet not rigid. Thena entered without escort, without ceremony, moving like someone who had never needed a witness to justify her presence. There was no preamble. Thena's gaze held the envoy in careful focus, then drifted beyond the chamber as if the whole throne world were laid out in her mind. When she spoke, the tone was neither accusation nor sermon. It was the calm delivery of a truth that had been tested in too many ages to need decoration. Humanity here is strong, she said, not in potential alone, but in fact. Your people endure horrors that would have broken civilizations in other skies. Your soldiers stand against nightmares and do not flee. Your cities rise even after being burned. That strength is undeniable. The envoy felt a faint stir of pride, then watched it settle as Thena's next words arrived. Strength does not free you. It binds you, she continued. Terra has made endurance into identity and fear into a map. Your empire reacts to threats as if reaction is the only virtue left. Every time danger comes from the warp or the void, you answer with force and sacrifice, and when it passes you seal the lesson inside dogma so tightly that nothing new can enter. You mistake repetition for safety and call it tradition. The words came steady and low, not harsh, but unyielding. The envoy recognized a pattern embedded in that diagnosis, the same pattern they had watched unfold through decades of crisis management. The Imperium was not weak because its armies were small or its faith thin. It was weak because the machinery of survival had become a cage. Thena spoke of dogma like a chain forged from good intentions that had rusted into cruelty. She did not mock the emperor's name, but she questioned the way his dream had been embalmed. She said the Imperium's fear of failure had turned into fear of change, and fear of change had turned into a slow, respectable kind of dying. Strength without direction becomes louder dying, she said. It is motion in circles while the galaxy moves on. It is holding a line so long that the line becomes a grave. Terra survives, yes, but survival alone is not destiny. The envoy absorbed the words without rushing to defend. Part of them wanted to speak of necessity, of the warp's predation, of how fragile any reform became under siege. Another part knew that Thena's clarity was not ignorance. It was the clarity of someone who had watched civilizations collapse not from invasion, but from refusing to evolve until invasion became inevitable. They answered softly, acknowledging the truth inside her assessment while naming the cost of change in this reality. Every attempt at reform had historically birthed schism and bloodshed. The galaxy punished softness. Dogma had been armor. The envoy said it without bitterness, only as fact. Thena listened, then inclined her head, accepting the danger while refusing to surrender to it. She did not offer a finished solution yet. She only laid the diagnosis on the table between them, like a map of a wound that could no longer be ignored. The envoy felt the chamber's stillness deepen. This conversation was not a threat. It was an invitation to see the Imperium clearly, and once seen, to choose what to do with that sight. The envoy sensed that Thena had not come merely to state the problem. She had come because something was approaching that would force an answer before Terra could hide behind habit again, and the thought passed through them like a cold wind, carrying them toward the next revelation. The envoy had barely formed the next question when Thena spoke again, bridging the chamber's silence with a calm that implied inevitability rather than drama. She did not claim prophecy. There was no mystical tone, no insistence that fate had whispered to her. The way she framed it was simpler, and somehow more alarming for that simplicity. There are those who follow crossings like mine, she said. Travelers between realities leave a trace, a disturbance, and some beings are built to hunt disturbances. I did not come here expecting pursuit so quickly, but the possibility was always present. The envoy felt the meaning settle slowly. The breach that had brought Thena to Terra had not been a one-way miracle. It was a beacon in the multiverse, bright enough to attract enemies who did not care about this world's wars or hierarchies. Thena's arrival had been the first tremor, and tremors invite hunters. She described them without embellishment. Not demons, not Xenos as the Imperium understood the term, not a rival empire within the galactic map. These were regulators from adjacent continuums, entities that treated unauthorized transit between universes as contamination. In her native cosmos, they had already crossed blades, and the battles had taught her their habits. They were precise, cold, and indifferent to collateral life. They would not bargain because bargaining assumed a shared moral frame. Their frame was correction. Their mission was removal. The envoy asked what removal meant in practical terms. Thena answered with the kind of directness that left no room for comfort. Their weapons were tuned to erase anomalies from existence. If they could not isolate the anomaly cleanly, they would excise entire regions to ensure success. A throne world packed with billions would not slow them. It would only widen the scale of devastation. So the danger approaching Terra was not contingent on this political standoff, she said. Whether the Imperium accepted her or tried to kill her, the hunters would still come, and Terra would still burn in the process. Their aim might be her elimination, but their method would break this system, whether the Emperor's banners stood united or scattered in schism. The envoy felt a grim clarity take shape. The Imperium's internal arguments had become a luxury they no longer possessed. Even if Thena were destroyed on the palace steps, the breach she had used would remain a scar that drew enemies. And if the hunters arrived to find her dead, they would still purge the residue, ensuring no anomaly remained, including the civilization that had hosted it. Thena watched the envoy process this, eyes steady, voice low. She did not use the prediction as leverage, but as responsibility. Her tone carried the quiet weight of someone who had already lived through the consequences of delay. She said she had hoped for time, perhaps enough to persuade Terra to coordinate defenses in a clean, unified pattern. But the multiverse rarely granted hope its full schedule. The hunters would arrive soon, measured not in months, but in weeks, perhaps less. The envoy asked why she had not announced this immediately to the palace factions. Thena's answer was not contemptuous. It was pragmatic. The Imperium, she said, would drown the message in accusation. Some would call it fabrication, a tactic to force submission. Others would waste the remaining time in doctrinal debate. She had chosen to tell the one figure trained to build coalitions through reason, because reason was the only response fast enough for what was coming. The envoy felt the responsibility land, heavy and unavoidable. This was not merely another threat to be rerouted through bureaucracy. It was an extinction-level timer attached to a situation already brittle with ideological fracture. Thena's final words in the chamber were not a plea. They were a quiet statement of the reality they both now inhabited. The hunters are coming. Terra will not survive their arrival unless it learns to move as one and to move quickly. The envoy nodded once, feeling their diplomatic instincts turn toward action. The diagnosis had become a countdown, and the countdown would not pause for tradition. With that sober handoff hanging in the air, they left the chamber knowing the next step was to carry this truth into the heart of the Empire, and to try to make Terra listen before the void itself forced silence. The envoy moved between factions like a ship threading an asteroid field, aware that a single wrong angle could shatter the mission before it began. The first stop was the Senatorum Imperialis, high lords seated in a chamber that smelled of incense and old power. The envoy laid Thena's data before them with careful precision, stripping away anything that could sound like fearmongering, presenting only a clean sequence of logic. A multiversal hunter fleet was inbound. Its methods would annihilate Terra. The defenses, as they stood, were not built to counter beings that did not follow warp doctrine or known Xenos vectors. The lords listened, then began to fracture into familiar alignments. Some wanted immediate mobilization. Others demanded proof beyond any proof deliverable within a collapsing timeline. Some suspected manipulation, a ploy to install Thena as savior before pressing a claim to rule. The chamber filled with the soft hiss of political survival instinct, each voice guarding its authority even as the horizon darkened. From there the envoy went to the Inquisition. If the Senatorum was slow, the Inquisition was sharp. The envoy endured interrogations threaded with psychic probes and analyzer rites, not out of hostility to them personally, but because the Inquisition treated doubt as its purest virtue. The Puritan conclave accused Thena of manufacturing a threat to justify her continued presence. The radicals, fewer but louder than expected, argued that any force hunting a being like her could also be hunted in return, perhaps even turned into a weapon. The envoy held to a narrow line. This was not a question of Thena's morality. This was a question of Terra's survival. They traveled next to the Mechanicus Synod, a forest of iron voices and binharic cant. The tech priests stirred at the mention of hunters from adjacent continuums. They asked for signatures, particle traces, dimensional residues. The envoy provided all Thena had allowed to be scanned. The priests translated the data into probabilities that even their doctrine could not deny. Threat confirmed, scale catastrophic, timeline shortening. Still, the response was not immediate unity. Some wanted to ally with Thena, others wanted to seize her for dissection to gain countertech. The old ache of ambition crept in again. Finally, the envoy stood before the custodes. The gold-clad guardians did not debate. They listened in silence, then questioned only what was necessary for strategic certainty. Their captain general did not promise cooperation. He promised vigilance, and the envoy felt the tension beneath that vow, the knowledge that vigilance without adaptation might become another kind of tragedy. Through all these encounters, the envoy worked the way Starfleet diplomats of forgotten ages had worked, not by demanding obedience, but by engineering common ground. The message was simple and repeated in different languages of power. No faction wins if Terra dies. Survival requires shared action. Shared action requires trust in facts rather than fear. Yet time slipped while halls filled with argument. Vox traffic increased. Mobilization orders collided. Each group tried to shape the coming crisis in a way that preserved its own primacy. The envoy heard it in the pauses, in the way people asked who would command the defense, what doctrine would be remembered as truth after victory. The Empire could not help itself. It was still practicing politics inside the throat of annihilation. As days shortened, the envoy returned often to Thena with updates that felt thinner each time. She listened without impatience. Her stillness was not resignation. It was calculation, the posture of a warrior who accepts that civilizations move slowly even when cliffs are beneath their feet. Still, the envoy sensed a narrowing window. The clock was ticking louder now, audible in the rising public anxiety, in the way the sanctum victory had become both inspiration and fuel for suspicion. Terra was debating while the void drew closer. The envoy felt their resolve harden into something almost stern, and knew that if consensus could not be forged, the coming threat would force a decision by violence instead. The last message of that week arrived with an early morning alarm from the outer system. Real space distortion, unknown vector, multiple massive contacts. The envoy stared at the hololith as dread turned to inevitability. Debate time was over. The hunters had arrived. The first sighting was not an image, but a pattern of errors blooming simultaneously across the Sol defense network. Stations at the system's edge reported space folding in ways that did not match warp emergence or standard translation. Auspex arrays returned clean silhouettes that slipped half a heartbeat out of phase with reality, as if the vessels were refusing to fully exist in any one dimension. When the data stabilized enough to project, the envoy felt the breath leave their body in a slow, controlled exhale. A fleet had entered real space without ceremony, without the psychic storm that always accompanied chaos, without the geometric brutality of known Xenos hulls. They were sleek and severe, constructs of dark metallic sheen threaded with light that did not read as plasma, not as void shield flare, but as something closer to mathematical inevitability. Even their motion felt different. They moved like precise edits to the void rather than ships traveling through it. Imperial admirals in orbit attempted challenge codes. No response came back. The Mechanicus pinged the fleet with binaric hail. Silence. Astropaths reached into the void for a psychic read and found only a cold absence, like trying to touch a blade's edge. The hunters were uninterested in negotiation because negotiation required recognition of Terra's claim to relevance. These vessels did not recognize Terra. They recognized only anomaly, and anomaly meant Thena. As the fleet advanced inward, it bypassed outer defense pickets with a technology the envoy could not name. Some stations reported clean passes through shield perimeters, as though the vessels had shifted partially out of real space, becoming insubstantial to physical and energy barriers alike. Attempts at firing solutions faltered. Law's batteries missed by fractions that should have been impossible with machine codex precision. Torpedoes detonated against empty void, their targets already somewhere else along a curve Imperial navigation could not compute. The envoy stood in the embassy war room beneath a hololith of the system, watching blue markers of Imperial assets blink in confusion, while the black-gray markers of the hunters slid forward with calm, terrible efficiency. Orders flooded in from fleets, governors, inquisitorial nodes. Every voice wanted to attach meaning to the contacts, to find a doctrine hook to hang response upon. The envoy relayed Thena's prediction to each command node again, trimming away politics until only survival remained. These are multiversal regulators, hostile to all collateral, aim fixed on the eternal, timeline immediate. No one needed further persuasion now. The hunter's presence spoke louder than any warning. The Senatorum issued emergency decrees. The Navy mobilized. The Mechanicus began activation rites for dormant archaeotech platforms. Even the ecclesiarchy, slow to bend, authorized full defense liturgies. Yet the envoy felt a quiet despair threading those actions. Every system they awakened was designed for enemies who believed in either the warp or the material universe. These vessels believed in neither as a limit. The fleet passed Mars' orbit within hours, not slowing, not splitting to address resistance. It ignored Imperial forces the way a surgeon ignores dust while cutting toward a tumor. It was coming for Thena and would carve the planet open to reach her if required. When the first hunter volley struck an outer defense moon, the impact was not an explosion in the usual sense. The moon's surface folded, then disappeared into a blurring fracture of space-time, as if a piece of it had been removed from causality. The envoy felt cold spread through their chest. Thena's earlier description was no exaggeration, their weapons erased rather than destroyed. What they could not isolate cleanly, they would excise wholesale. The war room fell into a hush that no command could fill. The hunters would reach Terra soon. Imperial reaction was finally unified, but unity without the right tools was another form of helplessness. The envoy turned from the hololith toward the private channel that linked them to Thena, and their voice carried calm certainty only because panic had no value now. The fleet is here. Continuation of debate is irrelevant. Terra needs your plan. The handoff was heavy, inevitable, and the envoy felt the next phase closing in like a storm front, one that would have to be met far from the throne world's fragile billions. Thena received the envoy's report without visible reaction. The news did not surprise her, only sharpened her focus. She stood within the embassy's sealed tactical chamber, hololith light glancing across her armor as if the machines themselves wanted to understand her presence. When she spoke, the tone was steady and low, not a call to heroism, but a statement of strategic necessity. "If they reach Terra while hunting me, this world dies," she said. "Their weapons are tuned to remove anomalies, and your planet will be collateral by definition. The path to survival is not to meet them here." The envoy felt the logic settle immediately. To fight near the Imperium's heart would be to invite excision on a planetary scale. The only way to protect Terra was to make Terra irrelevant to the battle. Thena explained her decision with simple clarity. She would draw the hunters away to a place empty of life, a battlefield where their eradication methods could not be justified by collateral calculus. She did not claim she could stop them by force alone, only that she could change where the stopping happened. Her strength was immense, but she did not pretend it was infinite. The plan depended on space, distance, and timing as much as muscle. She needed transport to a distant dead world within the system's outer reaches, a body with no population and no Imperial relic installations. She needed a corridor clear enough to move without being intercepted. She needed, most of all, the Imperium to resist the instinct to drag the fight back toward the palace simply because the palace was where all fights were traditionally won. The envoy listened, already calculating who must be convinced, what authorizations must be bypassed. Thena's plan was not a request for an army. It was a request for a narrow opening in Terra's rigid reflex architecture. That opening would have to be made through diplomacy faster than any diplomacy had ever moved. There was no grand requirement added to the plan. Thena did not ask to command imperial fleets. She did not demand oaths. She asked for a ship capable of reaching the chosen battlefield quickly, sheltered enough to avoid immediate hunter lock, and piloted by crews willing to accept that their role was not glory, but evacuation of war from the throne world's shadow. The envoy felt gratitude flicker beneath the pressure. Thena was not turning the Imperium into her weapon. She was trying to spare it the worst consequence of her presence, yet that was also a kind of judgment. She was acting because she believed Terra could not act in time on its own. They promised to secure what she required, not as a pledge of allegiance, but as a survival protocol. The envoy's mind moved through channels of authority like water finding cracks. The Navy could spare a fast strike cruiser. The Mechanicus could cloak its signatures with adaptive shielding. A rogue trader house might provide a vessel less predictable to the hunters, targeting algorithms. The envoy did not know which part would yield first, only that something must yield within hours, not days. Thena turned to the hololith and marked a location at the outer edge of the system, a barren planetoid locked in cold orbit, unclaimed, uninhabited. There she would make her stand, and there the hunters could be met without Terra paying the price for their correction. The envoy hesitated once, asking what would happen if the hunters ignored the bait and drove on toward Terra. Thena's gaze lifted, calm and severe. They will follow. Their mission is not conquest. It is erasure of my trace. If I place my trace far from Terra, they will pursue it. Their precision is their weakness. They cannot tolerate leaving the anomaly uncorrected. The envoy nodded, accepting the grim symmetry. A civilization built on reaction could be saved by an enemy built on inevitability, if inevitability could be redirected. As they moved to leave, Thena's final instruction was soft, almost human. Tell your people to hold the line, not for pride, but for time. If they must fight, let them fight away from the palace and away from civilians. Terra can endure a war in its outskirts. It cannot endure excision in its core. The envoy felt the handoff settle as responsibility once more. The plan was set. Now the Empire's reflexes had to be bent long enough to let it work. With the hunters sliding inward and the clock compressing into hours, the envoy stepped back into the machinery of Terra's politics, carrying Thena's strategy like a fragile flame through a storm toward the battles that would decide whether humanity survived its own rigidity. The voyage outward was silent except for the soft pulse of engines and the drumbeat of approaching inevitability. The envoy stood on the observation deck of the borrowed strike vessel, watching Terra dwindle from a world-filling presence into a blue-white ember behind them. They could feel the weight of that ember in their chest. Everything they had been trained to protect lived there, faith and flaws alike, and now they were carrying its survival on a plan that depended on one being's strength and an enemy's precision. Thena stood near the forward viewport, unmoving, eyes fixed on the black ahead. There was no bravado in her stillness. It was the stillness of a warrior conserving breath before a long fight. The hunters tracked them almost immediately. Imperial auspex confirmed it in cold, clinical tones. The strange fleet pivoted as one, sliding through real space on curves that defied navigation doctrine, their intent locked to Thena's signature as if the universe had etched her into their targeting matrix. They reached the chosen battlefield hours later, a barren planetoid locked in dead orbit beyond the system's crowded heart. Its surface was iron-gray dust and broken rock, its sky thin enough to be almost void. No cities, no shrines, no life to count as collateral. The strike vessel set down in a shallow basin, then withdrew at Thena's command, leaving her alone on the open plain. The envoy remained in high orbit, watching through magnified hololith feeds, feeling the helpless tension of a witness who can offer only attention. The hunters arrived like an incision. Their lead vessels phased into low orbit without resistance, then released smaller constructs toward the surface. These were not landing craft in Imperial terms. They were extensions of purpose-angular forms that fell without engines, cutting through air as though gravity served their will. They struck the ground with no shockwave, and from them emerged figures in segmented armor that shimmered with the same half-phased geometry as their ships. Thena met them in silence. She did not charge to grand music no one could hear. She advanced with measured steps, planting herself between the hunters and any line that could lead them back toward Terra. The first construct raised a weapon that hummed with quantum cold, a device meant to lock anomalies into a single reality for excision. Thena did not flinch. She closed the distance in a blur of disciplined motion and struck with an open palm that shattered the weapon's housing before it could fire. The hunter recoiled, then dissolved into a flicker of displaced matter as her second blow collapsed its armor inward. More came at once. Their coordination was surgical, 3 angles to every advance, overlapping fields of constraint designed to trap a traveler in an unescapable geometry. Thena could not counter their technology. She did not try. She countered their assumptions. Instead of retreating from their patterns, she stepped through them, refusing to be herded into a single kill box. Each movement was a lesson in close-quarters war, feinting to break their cohesion, striking joints and emitters, turning their precision against their reliance on predictability. The hunters adapted fast, shifting into new formations, their weapons carving shallow fractures into the planetoid's surface where reality buckled under forced collapse. The ground split into impossible angles, dust hanging in the air like frozen rain. Thena absorbed the danger with her body rather than with shields. Impacts that would liquefy a human only staggered her for a breath. She rose from each with the same controlled fury, not berserk, but relentless, a tide of strength guided by centuries of warrior discipline. The envoy watched the fight stretch into hours. No single blow decided it. This was endurance versus correction, a contest between a being who refused to yield and enemies who refused to deviate. Their leaders began to surface, larger constructs coordinating the field with subtle pulses of command. Thena found those pulses by instinct. She drove toward them through a storm of constraint beams, taking the hits that would have pinned another traveler into annihilation. Her armor cracked, dust streaked her face, yet her speed did not fade. When she reached the first leader, she did not trade blows. She seized it, lifted it bodily from the ground, and drove it into the planetoid's fractured surface with a force that rippled outward in silent shock. The leader's command pulse died. The hunter formation trembled. Thena moved through the opening like a blade through cloth, striking the next leader before the line could reform. A second pulse died, a third. With each collapse, the hunters lost the cohesion that made them terrifying and became merely soldiers facing a stronger soldier. Their fleet above began to withdraw, not in panic, but in calculated retreat. Their mission required leadership intact. Without it, continued surface engagement became inefficient by their own logic. Thena did not chase them into orbit. She stood in the dust, breathing steady, watching their ships peel away into the void. The planetoid's surface bore scars of fractured reality, but no life had been excised, no city erased. Terra, far behind her, still lived. The envoy felt a slow exhale loosen something in their chest. Thena had not out-teched the unknowable. She had outlasted it. She had broken their purpose by breaking the mind that carried it, and in doing so had scattered a fleet that could have unmade worlds. The battlefield fell quiet again, and that quiet carried them toward the return that would be harder than any strike of war. When the strike vessel curved back toward the inner system, Terra rose ahead like a rumor made solid. Its orbital layers were alive with readiness, fleets in patrol arcs, defense platforms lit with activated rights, but the panic of imminent excision had faded. The hunters were gone. The victory was undeniable, and yet the envoy felt no triumph settle inside them. Instead, there was a tightening awareness that saving Terra from an external threat did not save it from itself. They landed near the palace perimeter at dawn, returning to the same platform where Thena had first stood in silent judgment. The air smelled of incense and ozone, the lingering tang of a world always preparing for the next siege. What had changed was the formation waiting for them. The Custodes were still there, a wall of gold unbroken, but now they were joined by fresh arrivals, space marines in deep midnight tones, their armor etched with stormbolt heraldry, banners snapping in the palace wind. Behind them stood the Senatorum's emissaries, the Inquisition's hardened retinues, Mechanicus adepts with mechadendrites coiled tight. The Empire had organized itself into a single answering shape, not against the hunters, but against the possibility Thena represented. Chapter Masters stepped forward first, voices amplified through helm voxes with the calm authority of warrior orders that remembered unity. They acknowledged what Thena had done. Terra survived because she had drawn the threat away and broken it. Their tone carried respect, even gratitude, but it was gratitude fenced in by precaution. Then the demand came, soft but final. Her presence on Terra was no longer permitted. The breach she had brought, the hunters she had drawn, the fracture she had caused among factions, all of it marked her as an unacceptable variable to leave inside the throne world. The Imperium had endured salvation from outsiders before, and each time the price had been domination. It would not take that risk again, not even from a protector who had shown restraint. Thena listened without visible anger. The envoy watched her posture remain balanced, hands relaxed at her sides as if this was another phase she had already anticipated. She did not deny the fear behind the demand. She did not mock their caution. She simply asked, with a calm that made the words heavier, whether Terra believed it could survive the next such threat without repeating the same delays and rituals that had nearly doomed it. The Inquisition answered with law. The Custodes answered with silence that meant no. The Ecclesiarchy's representatives muttered prayers of purification. The Mechanicus representatives, who had once leaned toward study and alliance, now stood tighter, wary of being seduced into another heresy by the promise of progress. The war against the hunters had unified Terra for a moment. Now unity turned inward to defend dogma. The envoy stepped forward before they realized they were moving. Their voice came steady and low, threaded through fatigue and clarity. They spoke of what they had witnessed on the barren world, not just Thena's strength, but her choices, her refusal to bring war onto civilian soil, her method of saving Terra without demanding its submission. They said dismissal should not become denial, that the Imperium must learn from the encounter rather than bury it in fear. The response that returned was not cruelty. It was the ancient instinct of a wounded empire protecting its center. They did not threaten Thena with immediate destruction. They offered departure. It was the closest thing to mercy Terra could give without bending its spine. Thena turned her gaze to the envoy. There was no disappointment in it, only a kind of sorrowful recognition. She had hoped, perhaps, that Terra might accept a conversation about future direction after witnessing a different kind of defense. Instead, Terra was choosing the safer path, separation from what it could not control. She inclined her head, accepting the demand not as defeat, but as a verdict on Terra's readiness. The envoy felt the weight of that acceptance like a quiet bell. The battle for survival had ended. The battle for meaning was beginning, and Terra was choosing to face it alone. With the palace wind lifting dust around her boots, Thena stepped back toward the open void above, preparing to leave a world she had saved but could not stay within. The envoy watched the formation hold, weapons steady but unfired, and sensed the story crossing into its final handoff, where departure would carry more consequence than any war. The breach that opened for Thena's departure was not the warp's screaming wound. It was cleaner, quieter, a fold in reality that seemed to peel back like a veil rather than tear. Light rose around her in pale arcs, and for a moment the air itself felt suspended, as if the throne world was holding one last breath before the universe rearranged itself again. Thena did not offer a final speech to the gathered factions. She did not curse Terra for its fear, and did not bless it for its endurance. Her gaze moved across the assembled warriors, priests, adepts, and officials with the same calm assessment she had carried since arrival. It was the look of someone who understands that civilizations cannot be dragged into change without breaking, and that breaking is not salvation. When her eyes settled on the envoy, the meaning was softer, a silent acknowledgement of partnership in survival and perhaps of the harder truth beneath it. The envoy felt that truth without needing words. Thena had shown what direction could look like. Terra had chosen to keep its own hands on the helm. She stepped into the light, and the fold closed behind her with a hush that felt almost gentle. Where she had stood, the platform remained unchanged. No scorch marks, no warp residue, only the faint echo of a presence that had weighed Terra's soul and refused to own it. The void above returned to its familiar harsh clarity, defense grids resuming their old patterns as if to reassure themselves that the universe had been restored to doctrine. The formation around the platform began to loosen. Space Marines turned to their transports, already preparing to carry warnings through the astropathic web. Custodes resumed their eternal vigilance without visible alteration, yet the envoy sensed a difference in the air, a hairline fracture in certainty that could never be fully sealed. The Mechanicus adepts drifted into whispered binaric debates. The Inquisition's retinues retreated into compartmentalized analysis. The ecclesiarchy issued new sermons to frame the encounter as proof of faith. The Senatorum prepared its official narrative with desperate speed. But narratives could not erase what had been seen. The envoy returned to the embassy alone, passing through corridors that still carried the scent of recent alarms. In the quiet of their private sanctum, they opened a fresh chronicle log, hands steady despite the weight pressing behind their ribs. They recorded the facts first, as duty required. A breach not of the warp, arrival of an eternal warrior named Thena, 7-day standoff at the Eternity Gate, demon incursion repelled through her intervention, multiversal hunter fleet defeated off-world, departure demanded and granted. Each line was a clean stitch, sewing history into a form the Imperium could file. Then they recorded the truth that did not fit file headings. Thena had been warning and opportunity in the same body. Warning, because her arrival proved Terra was no longer the final center of cosmic order, and because enemies beyond doctrine could reach into Sol with methods the Imperium was not prepared to counter. Opportunity, because she demonstrated a way of fighting that protected life without requiring submission, and because she asked a question Terra had avoided for 10,000 years, what is strength for, if not to build a future rather than merely postpone extinction? The envoy wrote about choice, not as philosophy, but as survival trait. Terra had rejected Thena not because her strength was false, but because accepting her would have risked surrendering agency to an outside will, even a restrained one. The Imperium chose to remain flawed and free rather than perfected and ruled. That choice was dangerous. It might cost billions in futures yet unborn, but it was also the one thing the Emperor's oldest dream had never meant to extinguish. Outside the sanctum, Terra's city lights rose as night returned, imperfect spark against infinite darkness. The Astronomicon still burned, the fleet still patrolled, the Imperium endured as it always had, wounded but unbowed. Yet somewhere beneath endurance, a seed had been planted, the knowledge that survival could look different than terror, that protection could carry restraint, that dogma was not the only armor a civilization could wear. The envoy closed the chronicle with a final line, voice low even in thought. Thena came from the wrong stars and left without conquering, yet her shadow remains not as doomed certainty, but as a harder hope, the kind that demands humanity steer itself, learn itself, and if it must fall, fall by its own hand rather than kneel to another's path. They set the slate aside and looked toward the distant silhouette of the imperial palace. In its towering stillness, the empire seemed unchanged, but the envoy knew better. Terran stone remembers every footstep. The Imperium had taken a step it could never untake, and the echoes of that step would travel forward through war and time, shaping a future that was still theirs to choose. If you hunger for more tales of impossible encounters in the dark millennium, smash that subscribe button. And the Emperor protects those who support the channel.